Okay, today I'm going to talk about how science proves that God exists. In order to find truth, you need to have truth you can confirm things with. Truth never contradicts itself. You can't have two opposing statements and both of them be true. Either one of them is not true or both of them are not true, but something's not true. So, truth agrees with itself. So, you won't find truth contradicting itself. So, in science, we want to start with the laws of science. Scientific laws are things that have been proven and which are observable all the time. And so we know that these things are true. They've been proven to be true, and so they're called scientific laws. And we'll start with the scientific laws of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics pertains to heat and energy, but the laws of thermodynamics can also be applied to other aspects of science. But the first law of thermodynamics basically states that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can change forms. It can, be converted, but it can't be created nor destroyed. So, in other words, it can't just come from nothing. You can't. In order for anything to exist, something has to have always existed. That's the first law of thermodynamics. In order for anything to exist, something must have always existed. We never see anything coming from nothing. You can't just start with nothing and then have something come from it. There has to have always been something that existed. That's the first law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that everything left by itself eventually wears down. It eventually breaks down. It goes from order to chaos. With the exception that if something is acted upon by something that has the power and intelligence to improve upon it, then that thing can be sustained or improved. But there has to be something with the intelligence and power to improve it. In other words, a house just doesn't make itself. It just doesn't build itself. It doesn't just come up out of nothing and evolve into a house. It just never happens. There's never an explosion where something with intelligent design ever comes out of it. It never happens. You can't just have a random something happen. What actually usually happens is, say, a house, for instance. If a house sits long enough, it'll eventually break down and it'll become chaotic, and it'll break down and start just going back into dust. It'll eventually turn back into dust after long enough time. All the rafters will come down unless somebody with the intelligence and the power to make it better, to improve upon it, comes along and does that. So that's the second law of thermodynamics. You want to talk about the law of biogenesis. Okay, Louis Pasteur in the 1800s proved the law of biogenesis, and that means that life can only come from life. See, back in the in ancient Greek times, there were people that philosophized that life could come from rocks, that it could evolve out of rocks, especially with the help of their pagan gods. So they believed that life could come from inanimate objects. And in the 1800s, this thinking began to be promoted again. And someone tried to say that he had created life from chicken soup. And Louis Pasteur came along and through scientific experimentation, by removing outside sources, proved that when that soup was isolated, that no life form was generated. So he proved that life can only come from life. So these are scientific laws now. Because of the powers in this world that are trying to unite a global new world order, and they're trying to create a one world government, one world religion, one world currency, and everything under their power, so that the whole human race can become a slave. And yes, this is happening. They promote propaganda in the schools and in the mass media to try to lead people away from the truth. And so what we've seen is, even in the scientific world since the 1800s, a lot of this kind of propaganda has been promoted, and what's being taught in the schools is something called abiogenesis, which means not biogenesis. Even though biogenesis was proven to be true, they have abiogenesis, or not biogenesis, that they're teaching instead. And that's basically the same thing that the ancient Greeks were trying to say when they taught what's called spontaneous generation, where they believed that life forms could just come from rocks, that they could just evolve out of rocks. But what we see from these scientific laws of biogenesis and the laws of thermodynamics is that for anything to exist, something must have always existed. And that which always existed must have had the intelligence and the power to make everything there is, and to sustain it, and to improve upon it. And we also see that whatever that thing was that always existed and had that intelligence power was also a life-giving person, a life-giving being. It had to have life within it in order to create life. And those are scientific laws. Those are scientific facts. That's the way the world operates. And you can see these things observable every day. You just can't have a random explosion and then have a car come out of it. And yet there's millions and millions of cars, and yet people with going by a theory, which isn't really even a theory. It's a philosophy not based on anything. It's just a conjecture or an imagination. They're trying to say that everything was made out of an explosion. They have no proof or evidence whatsoever for that. In fact, since the 1800s, we can go back to the let's just put it this way. Since the 1800s, people have been trying to bring up so-called fossil finds of prehistoric cavemen that are supposed to be millions of years old. These bones are supposed to be millions of years old, and dinosaurs and things like that. It's kind of funny that they put plaster all over it, or it's made of plaster, and they try to say the reason the plaster is there because the bones would not last in a museum. So they're supposed to be supposedly putting these, billion-year-old bones out there that have survived all this time, and they're claiming they have to be completely plastered so that they won't, so that they won't turn to dust. Anyway, so that they won't. What the second law of thermodynamics says is they won't entropy. But anyways, they won't decay. But you see that if there were really dinosaurs and cavemen, we wouldn't have just started finding out about this stuff in the 1800s, and certainly not after it was already being talked about. They were already talking about it. In fact, in the British Museum, they had a dinosaur that was in the museum for about 50 years before they finally admitted it was a fraud. And a lot of the Cro-Magnon man, Java man, all these different so-called prehistoric cavemen that have been taught in the schools all these years and are still being taught were admitted a long time ago that they were frauds. An entire supposed extinct caveman came from a fossil of a single pig's tooth, And I'm going to leave some links on this video so that you can look up some of this information, have a place to start so that you can see how all these frauds came about. Now, if this was all true, if it was really true, we would have been finding all these dinosaurs and all these cavemen all these years. We would have been finding them. It wouldn't have suddenly happened right after people started trying to promote this stuff in the 1800s, and then just find a few of them around, and they certainly wouldn't be leaving million-year-old bones out anywhere. The oldest things known on the Earth uh, are not more than 6,000 years old. Uh, in fact, carbon dating. Some people try to use carbon dating to try to back up their so-called claims, but carbon dating has also been proven to be inaccurate. When trees that have been known to be 50 years old have been dated as 10,000 years old. And I'm going to leave a link to an article so that you can read that article, and you can look at all the references, and you can study these things and have a starting point to search from. Just even the common sense would tell you all this stuff. Now, if you really want to look for true history, we have history that dates back to the Great Flood. There's so much, and now we talk about Jesus and the history in the Bible. Not only do we have the eyewitness accounts in the Bible, but we have external witnesses that testify that those are the testimonies of Jesus. We have historians from that time period. We have Christian writings from that time period. We have people writing against the Christians from that time period. And the Bible was written in the first century. The New Testament was written in the first century. The Old Testament, as we know, was written from about 1400 BC to about 400 BC. And we have external witnesses to the Old Testament as well. There's tons of documentation and ancient historical documentation proving not only the existence of the Bible, but you can look into archaeology, the archaeology around Jerusalem and Israel and all that period of time. If you look into archaeology, it only confirms that the Bible is true, and the very fact that we date our number of years in our calendar based on when Jesus was born, this is something that's been almost 2 millenniums that we've been dating the calendar based on the birth of Jesus Christ. So if you really do some research, and a lot of people would just when people try to state things about evolution and that no God exists, they rely on their imagination rather than on the actual facts. So we also, one more thing is that the moral laws. There's morality. For God to exist, He had to be a God of love, but He also has to be a God of justice. And the very fact that there are moral laws that run things is another thing that identifies that God exists. But I'm going to give you a couple links to look at, and hope you'll think about these things and know that God loves you, and that He came as Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago to reveal Himself and to pay the penalty for the sins of the whole human race so that we can come back to Him and know Him. So God bless you, and if you have any questions, send me an email.